Hi, this is Craig Stocks here at Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. Today's video is going to be a little different. We're going to focus on color and color saturation and kind of dive deep into color processing in Photoshop. So what prompted this video was last week or so, there was a video released by Seti Astro, who has some great content. I would encourage you to check out his channel on YouTube. He also has some really nice plugins for PixInsight that are available free of charge. So again, check out the work that he's doing. A lot of good work there. But he was talking about the difference between chroma and saturation. And he was talking about it specifically as it relates to PixInsight, and if you're watching this channel, you might be the type of person who does a lot of your processing in Photoshop. So I wanted to take a look at saturation and its effects in Photoshop. And one thing that he mentioned that I'm not sure if he really meant it this way, but it sounded like he was saying that adjusting chroma was somehow better than using saturation, because it didn't have a corresponding effect in the luminance. It was changing just the color value without changing the brightness of that color. And he implied that that was a better way to do it because of that. And I guess from my perspective, I would say that the reason we process images is to create differences, whether they're differences in color or tone. If you look, for instance, at an image that has RGB, sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen mapped into RGB. In a color image, hydrogen and sulfur look the same. They're both basically the same color red, even though in reality they're different elements and they exist in the image in different places. And in order to bring out that difference, we shift the color of hydrogen from its natural red color. We shift it to be more of a yellow or green color, and that allows us to see the differences between sulfur and hydrogen that look the same but in reality are different. So our purpose, at least from my perspective in processing images, is to highlight those differences and bring out things that, even though they may look the same, in reality are different. There's really, when you're processing color, whether it's saturation or shifting the color or whatever, by the time you get to that point, you're not working with science data, you're working with a photograph. Again, that's my perspective. But to me, at that point, the science train has already sailed, that you're no longer dealing with science data, you're dealing with a photograph, and your goal is to make that photograph as good as you can and bring your vision to that image. So with that, let's dive into saturation in particular and how it affects an image. So to start with, we're going to look at this color gradient. I'm going to make myself even smaller here so that you don't have to look at me. So here's a color gradient I created in Photoshop, and it is from red to green to blue, so it doesn't include all colors. For instance, it doesn't include magenta, but it has most of the colors. And it was relatively easy to create. And what I did was created each one of the colors, red, green, and blue, with 50% luminance, 50% saturation, and then the hue value of either red, green, or blue, so that they're relatively uniform across. That they're starting out, they have the same luminance value. So an interesting test then, if these were created with the same luminance value, if we convert this to just plain luminance, you would think they would all look the same. It would be just a solid gray image. Now the way I have this constructed, this is in a layer group, and the layer group is actually in luminosity blending mode. So if I turn on this background, then instead of seeing colors, we're only going to see the luminosity of each one of those colors. And what you see is, in fact, it is not just a simple gray image, that there's some light and dark, and in fact the green is brighter than the red, and both of those are brighter than the blue. That's somewhat in keeping with kind of color theory in general. Red and blue are generally dark colors, and as you darken the color, you increase saturation. So a dark blue and a dark red and high saturation kind of go together. Green and yellow, on the other hand, are bright colors. Yellow especially is a bright color. And increasing saturation increases brightness, or increasing brightness generally increases saturation. Or the way to think of it is, with yellow, brighter and more saturated go together. With red and blue, darker and more saturated go together. And one of the things that I like to do in my images, and you could argue whether I achieve it or not, is to have a uniform level of saturation in the various colors, so that I don't want to have one color significantly or noticeably more saturated than the other colors in the image. I want it to feel that there's a color saturation harmony as well as a pleasing overall color balance and color tone. So anyway, the point here is that if we just look at this in grayscale, it's not pure gray. Now again, this is in Photoshop. This is in the sRGB color space, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And it's in 16-bit mode, so it has a lot of options or different resolution levels between 0 and fully saturated, or in the 8-bit world you'd say between 0 and 255. In the 16-bit world it goes from 0 to 65,535. 65,535 is white. 255 in the 8-bit world is white. It's not more white or more black. There are just more divisions between the 0 and the maximum. So what happens if we change the saturation? So let me turn the background off so we see the colors. And let's start first with a hue saturation adjustment layer. And if I come in here and increase the saturation, we see exactly what we expect. The saturation goes up, or we can desaturate it and the saturation goes down. And you might notice something interesting. When I desaturated it here, notice that the green is still a little brighter. There's dark bands here, but the blue, rather than being darker, is actually a little bit lighter than here. So what we're seeing is desaturating the image with the hue saturation slider gets us a different result than desaturating the image with just a simple luminance blending mode. And in fact, if I turn this background back on, what we're looking at now is this color image desaturated with the hue saturation adjustment layer, and then that whole thing turned into grayscale. So we can see in grayscale the effects of saturation. So now if I change saturation, what you're seeing is you're seeing this image, but in luminance only. So luminance only of this looks like that, and as I adjust that saturation, you can see that the effect is not uniform or linear across the image. Now, there's more than one way to adjust saturation in Photoshop. If we turn off this hue saturation layer and instead use a vibrance saturation or vibrance adjustment layer. Vibrance has both a vibrance slider and it also has a saturation slider. And you would expect that saturation slider would behave just like the saturation slider in a hue saturation adjustment layer. But guess what? It doesn't. Notice, this adjustment from minimum to maximum is not the same as this saturation adjustment from minimum to maximum. So I guess the point here, I don't want to get too lost in the weeds. The point here is there are different tools that adjust saturation and they have different effects on brightness. And whether it makes the color brighter or darker really isn't the point. The point is to pay attention to what the adjustment is doing, and is it making a change that you like, or is it making a change that you don't like? If you don't like the way it's making the change, then you can either try a different tool, or you can add additional adjustments to fine-tune the brightness and the saturation of individual colors. Some ways you might do that. In hue saturation, right now we're just adjusting the master level. Let's turn this back into a color image. I can target, for instance, just the reds and increase the saturation of just the reds and leave the greens and blues alone. Or I can target just the blues and leave the reds alone. So there are some tools that you can change the lightness, the saturation, and even the hue of individual colors with a hue saturation adjustment layer. So if you don't like the way it's adjusting saturation on a global level, you can kind of dig in a little bit and focus on just individual colors. Now, a couple interesting things I found along the way. I mentioned earlier that this image is in the sRGB color space. So we're going to dive a little bit into color spaces and what they are. So I'm going to switch over to some training material that I've used in the past. If I can get the right thing on the screen here. So let's talk about color and color spaces. So let's start with this. And let me get the right window up here. So consider this example. Somebody asks you, what's the temperature outside? And the answer is 20 degrees. That doesn't really answer the question, because just knowing a number, knowing it's 20 degrees, doesn't really tell us, is it warm or cold? Is it Fahrenheit or Celsius? So without knowing that measurement scale, the number by itself is meaningless. And that's true not just of temperature, but it's true of color, it's true of anything. If I tell you I have 3 and don't tell you what, don't give you a frame of reference or a measurement scale, you don't know what I'm talking about. Does that mean I have 3 eyes? Does that mean I have 3 apples? Does that mean I have 3 years of experience? You don't know. And the same is true with color. Without a frame of reference, we don't know what those RGB colors mean. And that's the role of a color space. A color space provides that frame of reference to give meaning to the RGB values. And the same color will have different RGB values in a different color space. So we have to fully specify a color. We have to know the red, green, and blue values if we're working in an RGB color model, and there are multiple color models. And we also have to know the color space. So if I tell you that this block is color values of red 141, green 100, and blue of 57, commonly written 141, 157, with red, green, blue in that order, and I tell you it's in the sRGB color space, now you know exactly what that color is, and you can translate that specific color into other models. If you send it to a printer, your printer knows exactly what color you want, so it can put down the correct cyan, magenta, yellow, and black inks in order to produce the same color, even though it may have different values. So the world contains more colors than we can see. The electromagnetic spectrum goes all the way from very long radio waves to very short high energy gamma waves, and lots of stuff in between. We see just a tiny slice of that in our visible color. Infrared, ultraviolet, all those are beyond what we can see. Monitors and printers can't display all the colors we can see. Especially monitors and printers, they're limited, and the more expensive the monitor or printer, the better it will do, but it still won't come anywhere near producing all the colors that we can see. A color space defines the range of colors and how they live. It gives meaning to those RGB values, and generally it defines that color in the RGB color space relative to some standard, usually something like a CIE LAB color model with a D50 illuminant is a common reference that could be used as a general purpose. The color gamut defines the extent of the colors. In other words, how blue can we see, how red can we see, how green can we see. And once you go beyond what the color gamut allows, then it basically is going to be clipped or truncated. So if I have if I do the color calculation and I determined that this color should have a red value of 290 and the maximum of allowable is 255, it has to get reduced down to 255 somehow. So the gamut defines how much of the visible colors are available in this particular color space. You may run across a term of rendering intent. Rendering intent primarily defines how out of gamut colors are handled. And the two most common are going to be relative colorimetric and perceptual. And they basically deal with how out of gamut colors get compressed back into gamut. Common RGB color spaces that you'll most commonly see is sRGB. That's kind of the least common denominator, and that's the one I really recommend most people use. It's the best match for JPEGs online. Most processes, if it doesn't know any better, will assume sRGB. Sometimes, even if it does know better, it will assume sRGB. Most monitors, good monitors, can display the full sRGB color space. Better monitors can display a broader color space, and the next larger one would be Adobe RGB 1998. If you have a kind of a good high-end inkjet printer, it can probably print pretty much all of the colors in the Adobe RGB color space, so it gives you a little bit more, a few more crayons in the box, if you will. ProPhoto RGB is a very wide gamut, and it even includes colors, beyond what could be displayed or printed on any device, but in some cases even beyond what we can see. So, it has its use, but unless you're a color expert, I would advise sticking with either Adobe RGB if you really know what you're doing, and if you just want to stay out of trouble and get good color, stick in the sRGB color space. And fortunately, you can set sRGB as your preferred working color space in both PixInsight and Photoshop, so that everybody's talking the same colors. So ProPhoto is the largest, Adobe RGB next largest, and sRGB is smaller but the most universal. So with that overview of color spaces, let's dive in a little bit. So here I mentioned that this was in the sRGB color space, and that also implies that I'm looking at it in the RGB color model, that I'm defining each pixel in here by its red, green, and blue values. There's another way that's commonly used, and that's the LAB color model. So if we take this same image and we put it into a Photoshop document that's in the LAB color space, sometimes you'll hear people call it lab. It really stands for luminance A and B channels, and the A and B channels are the two color channels, and luminance is simply luminance. So one nice thing about the LAB color space is it separates luminosity from color. And one thing you can do in Photoshop, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a small window, and you can see, you might be able to see on mine right now, it says LAB color 16 BPC, or BPX, which is bits per pixel. 16-bit color, if you will. There's a little triangle next to that. If you click on the triangle, that will open up, and you'll see there's lots of different options for what you can show in this little info window down here. Document profile is a convenient one if you want to really keep track of what color profile you're currently using. Document size is another interesting use. So there's a couple different options that you can have for what's displayed down here. I tend to just leave it set on document profile, and that lets me very quickly validate that I'm in the color space I think I'm working in. You'll also notice on the individual tabs, it tells you this is untitled because I haven't saved this. And you can see in parentheses here, LAB/16. So I know this document is in the LAB color space or color model at 16-bit depth. The one we were looking at earlier is an RGB 16-bit. So let's look at what happens if we're in an LAB color space. And of course we can do the same thing. I can adjust the hue saturation, and we see saturation increasing and decreasing. I don't know if you remembered, but let's just increase saturation a fair amount. And let's pop back over to the RGB version and increase saturation. And you may notice they're different. That in the LAB color space, the same tool, the same color saturation works differently. That's not necessarily good or bad, it's just different, and it's useful to know that it's going to be different so that you're not surprised by unpredictable results. Let's do the same thing of putting this group in, and let me reset the saturation first. Let's just put this in luminosity blending mode. So I'll change my blending mode from normal to luminosity. And now we see, much like we did with the RGB, we have not a pure gray, but we have a little bit of a gradient from dark to a little bit lighter to quite a bit darker. Let's turn on this hue saturation and let's adjust the saturation. Notice what happens. In the LAB color space, I can move saturation up and down, left and right, all I want, and it has no effect on luminosity or brightness. So if I really, really want to adjust saturation completely independently from brightness, I can do that in the LAB color space. Now, interestingly, if I load this same document into PixInsight and convert it to RGB, or convert it to grayscale, I should say, and save it, it gives me a grayscale image, more like the LAB image. And you'll find that adjusting saturation, like in the LAB color space, if you use the curves and saturation tool, it doesn't affect luminosity. It only affects, you can adjust saturation, and then if you convert it to grayscale, you get the same grayscale image regardless of saturation, I guess is the way to say that. But also notice that it is a little bit different. Converting a color image to grayscale in PixInsight does the math a little bit differently. It's not exactly like LAB. It's not exactly like an RGB in Photoshop. It's a little bit different. It's a kind of a beast of its own. Again, not good or bad, just something to know that you are going to get something different. But that does bring me to one final point, and that is, let's jump over to PixInsight. One of the tools in PixInsight is, if you go to Edit and Color Management Setup, there's a lot of things here that you may or may not have ever looked at. This is the way I have mine set, and I have found it works well for a couple different reasons. My default color profile I have set to sRGB, and if you remember I said I use sRGB because that's the most universal, and it will just in general keep you out of trouble from having colors that you can't see and can't manage. So I really recommend using sRGB. Under grayscale, you may or may not have ever looked at this, and there are a variety of different profiles available from the drop-down. Most of these are color profiles. I happen to have an Epson Gray Gamma 2.2, and that's pretty similar to the sRGB grayscale, or S-Gray, that I have set as my default in Photoshop. You may or may not have this gamma curve available depending on what color profiles are installed on your system. The important thing is you want this to be something so that when you save the image, you also want to check both of these boxes: embed ICC profiles in RGB and grayscale images. Now, it will let you choose something like sRGB for your color space for a grayscale image, and you can check, save that ICC profile. What will happen though is when you open that image in Photoshop, it won't look the same. It'll look different. And the reason it's different is because Photoshop won't recognize an sRGB color space in a grayscale image. So it gives you a warning that the embedded color space is invalid, or the embedded color profile is invalid. So it defaults to untagged, and it doesn't know what those RGB or those luminance values mean because there is no frame of reference. So you can assign it to a proper frame of reference, but you're probably going to wind up with something different than what you started with in PixInsight. And I went through that exercise, and let me just show you the results. So let's open a couple files here, and I may have to go hunting for them. So here is the image we were just looking at. So you can see what this image looks like, and you may notice when I flick back and forth that it's actually a little bit lighter in Photoshop than it is in PixInsight. And let me grab this again because the untagged version is even more dramatic. Oh, I have to look in the, let me look in the right folder for a change. So we want the D drive, my Astro images. This was from the Dream Scope, and this is M78. Here we go. So this first one is this image just saved as a grayscale. And you see the image, the embedded ICC profile cannot be used because the profile is invalid, ignoring the profile. So that's the message that I get telling me that saving it with an sRGB profile in grayscale doesn't work. And the result is, if you look down here in the little information box, it says untagged gray, 16-bit per channel. Now, if I load this same image that was saved in my Epson grayscale 2.2, and it's a 2.2 gamma, we did not get the error message. And notice when I flick back and forth, it's darker. And in fact, this version much more closely matches what we see in PixInsight. If I do kind of a split screen here, if I can match these up somewhat. So on the top is the PixInsight window, on the bottom is the Photoshop window, and you can see that those match pretty well. If I looked at that compared to the sRGB version, it's quite a bit brighter. In other words, I had an unintended or unexpected change in the overall brightness level when I saved the image and opened it in Photoshop. I didn't get what I expected to get, and that's a problem. So the solution to that, again, is in your color management setup to be sure to choose an appropriate grayscale profile for your grayscale images, and then embed profile, and that way it's embedding a valid ICC profile in that grayscale image. And then when you open the image in Photoshop, and particularly if you do what I normally do is open layers. Those layers typically include both color and grayscale files. And what Photoshop will do is automatically recognize that there's a color image there, therefore it needs to be in an RGB color space. It will use the default sRGB color profile, and it will convert from my Epson Gray 2.2 grayscale profile. It'll convert to an sRGB profile, maintaining as best it can, maintaining the brightness levels and adjusting the numbers if necessary, so that I have the expected level of brightness throughout the image. In Photoshop, by the way, you adjust that in Edit, Color Settings. And here's where I have specified sRGB as my default color working space. And I have, for grayscale, I've selected S-Gray, which is kind of it's the sRGB tone response curve out color. The default is .gain 20. That would work also. The most important thing is having it tagged in PixInsight so that when you load it into Photoshop, it knows how to convert it. So, sorry for this kind of long and rambling diatribe talking about color and color saturation. The important points here are most of the time you're going to be working in an sRGB color image, and that color image, when you adjust the saturation, is going to change the brightness. And it may change it in ways that you like, it may change it in ways that you don't like, but be aware of it, watch for it. If you see it changing brightness and you don't like the way it's changing the brightness, you may find that using the saturation slider in the vibrance tool has a more controlled effect. You may also find that adjusting vibrance has an even more subdued effect. So using one of these other tools to adjust saturation might work better if you're adjusting global saturation. Note, however, that you don't have individual channels that you can focus on with the vibrance tool, where with the hue saturation tool you can target individual colors and adjust their brightness. So if I, for instance, adjust global saturation and I don't want it to darken the blues, I can target the blues, lighten them up, and get the result I want, the visual result I want, regardless of what the tool tells you. So don't let the tool dictate. Let your eye and your vision and your goals for the image tell you what you want. Hope that answered some questions for you. If you have any questions, drop those in the comments down below. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.